They say that talking to yourself is a sign of insanity. But I think that's only if you answer back. Right? Right. This is Talking to Myself, a podcast where I use anecdotes from my life to try to make myself a better artist and hopefully a better person. Additionally, other people hopefully can get some benefit from this as well, but really I'm just trying to save some money on therapy. Today on the podcast, I thought we'd talk about tools and improvisation. I grew up in a small rural town in North Carolina, which is in the country, basically. I grew up in a lower middle class family for the most part, so we didn't have a lot of money kicking around a lot of time. And my family had always been hardworking people. My grandfather was a farmer and then an agricultural extension agent for the state rather. My dad always had a farm, even though he's not technically a farmer. We always had land to work and chores to be done, so to speak. We ended up making a lot of the stuff we needed ourselves or reusing things that were intended for other purposes, which I like a lot of people who grew up in that area did. It was pretty common. Nobody bought a brand new fishing pole every year with a fancy casting fly reel or anything like that. That wasn't really the kind of fishing we did. I remember making a fishing pole out of a piece of bamboo cane and making a float out of a cork. I had real fishing line because nothing else was strong enough. I went out and hunted up my own bait. Of course, as a kid, you dig up worms for bait. And I went fishing with that, several summers worth. And it worked fine, quite frankly. I remember the first time I used a rod with a casting reel on it. I was like, how does this even work? This is bizarre. But it was cool because you could get out to the middle of the pond that way. And I say pond because we never went to lakes or rivers. There weren't any lakes or rivers close by. There were ponds. Usually someone has some land and they've got some water on it and you're allowed to go fish there because your granddaddy knows their uncle or something like that. Or you trespass and sneak in and fish without asking. That happens occasionally. Also, I seem to remember an incident where my grandfather had a truck on his land. Not licensed, obviously, not street legal. This happens a lot too. You'll have farm vehicles that they're basically just cars and trucks, but they won't pass inspection. And they're not legal to drive on the road, so they just use them on the farm. My grandfather had a truck. I believe it was a 69 Ford. It's pretty old. And he wanted me to move it for him. I was like 14 or something. You learn how to drive vehicles and tractors and stuff really early when you're young. I went down to move it for him. There's no steering wheel. The man had clamped a pair of vice grips onto the steering column, the kind you lock in place, and that was the steering wheel. So, that was fun. It worked fine. It's just a little weird. It didn't seem weird at the time because I was a kid, but thinking of it now, I was like, that's funny. Probably dangerous too, but pretty funny. I mean, you barely got above 20 miles an hour on the farm anyway. Who cares? That kind of attitude has really helped me a lot in art. It's actually helped me and not helped me. Let me explain. My traditional way I look at art, doing traditional art, not digital stuff here, is to use whatever you can get your hands on. Crayons, pencils. All through school, of course, you drew with your pencil in your notebook when you're supposed to be doing math problems or whatever it is. So we got pretty good at line drawing and shading with a number 2 pencil, or HB if you live in the metric system area like I do now. So I didn't touch charcoal until I went to art classes in high school. But I knew how to draw with a pencil pretty well. And if you're lucky, sometimes you get colored pencils. Those are pretty good too. You can learn how to do values and stuff with one shade. That comes in handy. It's a good skill to have. Ballpoint pens, if you can work it well, can get some nice shading and also linear stuff, of course. The point is, you can use almost anything for almost any kind of art you want to make. But you need to remember there are certain things that tools are good at and best at. I've done paintings with coffee and any kind of stain you can use. You just have to treat it like watercolor. You do layers of thin color and you build up your darks that way. You can't just start with solid darks. Also, coffee tends to stay water soluble, at least on the stuff I was using, the substrate I was using it on, the paper I was using it on. So you have to be careful about re-wetting it again because it immediately starts dissolving again. It's obviously not archival, so it won't last, it won't stand the test of time. But then again, quite frankly, watercolors aren't either. So it's important to have the attitude that you can use almost anything at hand to make the art you want to make. it shouldn't let the cost of art materials or availability of art materials be a detriment to you making art. If you want to make something, as long as you can get your hands on at least a pencil or a burnt piece of stick, anything, then you can make art. Just don't fall into the trap that I've fallen in too many times. And here's the part where I advise myself, and the reason for these podcasts is so I can stop from making dumb mistakes that I make. I tend to stick with the same materials that I have. In this case, colored pencils. I'll use any brand of colored pencils I can get. Even though I know that I prefer Prismacolor because of the quality of the pigment and the wax inside. I assume it's wax. They're smoother. They can hold a sharp point better. But I always find myself buying cheap colored pencils. I've probably got 20 sets of colored pencils. I don't have a set of Prismacolors. I've got a few colors of Prismacolor that I use. And if I seriously got into colored pencil stuff, I mostly do colored pencils for accent color on top of markers. But until recently, I didn't have a full set of marker colors either, and I had all kinds of mismatched brands and stuff, which is fine. You can use them that way. It's not a big deal. But if you want consistent results, you kind of need to stick with at least one brand. So if I want to get heavy into colored pencils, I should probably invest in some Prismacolors, right? I mean, there are reasons why not to do that. Obviously, Prismacolors are pretty expensive, and colored pencils, generally speaking, are not. I think in that case, the quality is probably worth it. So the next time I go to an art supply store, or next time I have an opportunity to get them cheaply, I probably will buy a full set of Prismacolor colored pencils. It's weird. It's like a double-edged sword. I'm going to mention there's a lot of double-edged swords in art. The ability to use almost anything to draw with or paint with is really good because that means you can draw or paint with almost anything. It also means that for certain effects, you have to work really hard. To make fine, detailed lines in, say, coffee or tea or something like that, you got to have some serious hand control because you're going to have to go over that line like 5 times. It's going to get blurry at least. Whereas if you had, black ink, you can do a fine line quite well with a brush. And it's opaque and it's right there. You make one line and you're done. That type of attitude can be good and bad, like everything else. The other thing is, another good aspect of it is sometimes that resistance is good. The difficulty that materials that aren't meant for certain things give you to do that effect can make you work harder at it, make you try to think more to understand how to get this effect with what you have at hand. And that can make you more of a conscientious artist, which is always good. The more focused you are on the technique to achieve what you want, the more likely you are to get what you want. And of course, you know that I love freeform art where I just randomly scribble something and don't even pay attention to what I'm doing. But that's like throwing darts at a wall that doesn't have a dartboard on it. You're not going to get exactly what you want every time. You might get something really cool. You might get something you didn't realize you wanted. But if you have something in mind that you want, you're not going to get it that way. So, to remind myself and hopefully help other people, feel free to use anything you can possibly get your hands on. Have fun experimenting with them. That's the other thing too. Another detriment to me just personally to me, I spend a lot of time experimenting with materials. I'll draw something I know how to draw just to test out the material. And I do that probably 40 to 50% of the time I do art is that. When I could be innovating, learning how to do new things, new subjects. Not new techniques, but new subjects. I could be producing new works, new finished works, instead of a bunch of tests, studies, examples, training, basically. Training's good, but it needs to be a smaller portion of your output than final work. Unless you're just learning how to do art in the first place, in which case, all bets are off. You do whatever you need to do to learn what you need to learn. At this point in my career, I should be able to produce finished work relatively frequently. And if I'm spending all my time practicing new materials and learning how to use them, and then maybe even deciding I don't like them, the coffee thing was great. It was a lot of fun, but I don't like it as much as like ink wash. And it's a very, very similar effect. I can do color change in the computer, make it look exactly like coffee. So there's no reason for me to go through the trouble of setting up coffee in different strengths and then using that kind of wash. It's a novelty thing for me. So I probably won't do it again. I'm glad I did it. It was fun, but I learned that I don't need to use that difficult to use material when I can just use something that gives me the same result, easier and better, and just as cheap. You can get ink pretty cheaply. So definitely experiment with new materials. Learn to use what you can get your hands on. Don't let that keep you from finishing something, though. That's my advice to myself today. So listen up, self. Don't be a dumbass. Try not to, anyway. As always, thank you guys for listening to this. Hopefully someone else gets some benefit out of this. I always wonder if that's happening or not, but hopefully it is. Special thank you to my patrons at Patreon. You guys are the shiniest people I know, and you get to see these and hear these a week earlier than the rest of the entire world. You deserve better, but that's what you get. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening. Thank you everyone who's still listening. Take care and keep making the things you make, however you make them.